Tonight, the Venezuelan president sits in a jail cell in Brooklyn. He landed upstate earlier today after being captured early this morning by the U.S. military in that controversial raid.
A remarkable and historic scene tonight in New York. Federal agents escorting off a U.S. government aircraft the now former president of Venezuela. This after Nicolás Maduro and his wife Celia Flores had been captured during a U.S. military raid on the presidential palace in the Venezuelan capital of Caracas. President Trump announcing the extraction of Maduro, who is taken to the United States to face federal charges of narco-terrorism.
Nicolás Maduro has arrived in New York hours after President Trump announced the U.S. had captured Venezuela's president after launching strikes on the country. A social media page run by the White House posted this video you can see here. It shows Mr. Maduro entering the Drug Enforcement Administration headquarters in New York.
Bold and very controversial attack by the United States in Venezuela, an extraction of the president of that country. This comes 36 years to the day that the U.S. did essentially the same thing in Panama to the president Noriega at that time. But this dynamic is much different than that one.
Let's talk about what happened in the span of 24 hours between January 2nd and January 3rd, 2026. On January 2nd, Attorney General Pam Bondi was facing a bipartisan impeachment effort. Republican Representative Thomas Massie and Democratic Representative Ro Khanna had announced they were drafting impeachment articles. Massie had posted a Twitter poll showing 77% support for impeachment among his followers. The issue was straightforward. The Epstein Files Transparency Act required the Department of Justice to release files by December 19th. The deadline passed. The DOJ released heavily redacted documents with a search function that didn't initially work. Then, on Christmas Eve, they announced they'd discovered over 1 million more documents, contradicting their earlier claims that the file review had been exhaustive. Congress was set to return on January 7th, just 4 days away. A contempt vote was being planned. Survivor advocacy groups were organizing to testify. This wasn't going away. 24 hours later, none of that was on the front page. On January 3rd at 4:21 a.m., the administration announced a military operation in Venezuela that resulted in the capture of Nicolás Maduro. Every major news outlet pivoted immediately. Cable news went wall-to-wall with Venezuela coverage. Social media trends shifted from Bondi impeachment to Venezuela sovereignty crisis. Congressional Democrats who had been preparing to hold hearings on the Epstein Files statutory violation were now scrambling to respond to potential War Powers Act violations in South America. And Pam Bondi, who 48 hours earlier was facing impeachment for missing a statutory deadline, was now preparing to prosecute a captured foreign leader in federal court. I want to be very clear about what I'm arguing here and what I'm not arguing. I am not claiming that the Venezuela operation was executed specifically to save Pam Bondi from impeachment. I don't know what conversations happened in the White House Situation Room, and neither do you. What I am saying is this: regardless of intent, the effect was a complete reset of the media ecosystem at a moment when domestic accountability pressure had reached a critical point. And this is not the first time we've seen this pattern. This is about incentive structures, not conspiracy theories. This is about attention economics. And this is about recognizing a pattern that has repeated across multiple administrations, both Republican and Democratic, for decades. Let me show you how this works. First, let's establish what the domestic situation actually looked like in the 48 hours before Venezuela. The Epstein Files story had momentum. This wasn't just progressive activists complaining on Twitter. This was a bipartisan statutory violation with measurable public support and concrete next steps. The law said not later than 30 days. That's December 19th. The deadline passed. That's not a political interpretation. That's a calendar. Then came the Christmas Eve document dump, which is already a classic move when you want to bury something. The DOJ announced they'd found over 1 million more documents. But wait, Back in March, officials said they had the complete set of files. In July, they described their review as exhaustive. Now in December, there's suddenly a million more? The contradiction was impossible to ignore, and Senator Chuck Schumer said exactly that, calling it proof of a massive cover-up. This created a problem that flood the zone tactics weren't solving. Usually, if you announce 5 different things in one day, the media fragments its attention and no single story gains traction. But this story had something most stories don't have: a statutory deadline that had objectively passed, a bipartisan coalition forming around accountability, and survivors who were organizing to demand transparency. Representative Massey's poll was particularly significant. When a Republican congressman posts a poll showing 77% of respondents support impeaching a Republican attorney general, that's not background noise. That's a data point that other Republicans notice. It means the issue has crossed partisan lines. It means there's cover for Republicans who might want to vote for accountability without being accused of betraying their party. The political calendar made this even more pressing. Congress was returning January 7th. That's a Tuesday. Within days or weeks, there would be votes. Contempt proceedings were being planned. Impeachment articles were being drafted. The machinery of congressional oversight was turning, and it was pointed directly at Pam Bondi. Meanwhile, the administration was already facing War Powers Act violations over boat strikes in the Red Sea that had been ongoing since September. The 60-day deadline for congressional authorization had passed on November 3rd. Senator Tim Kaine had promised to force a Senate vote in January. So there was already one constitutional violation happening in slow motion. This was the landscape on January 2nd. Multiple accountability mechanisms converging, bipartisan pressure building, a holiday period ending, and Congress about to return. Survivors preparing to testify. Media attention focused on statutory violations and potential impeachment. Then Venezuela happened. Here's what changed in 24 hours. Every major outlet shifted. The New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, all of them led with Venezuela. Not just led with it, devoted essentially all of their coverage to it. You had live shots from Caracas, analysis of what happens next, international reactions from Russia and China and Brazil, legal discussions about war powers and the capture of a foreign leader, speculation about oil reserves and what, quote, run Venezuela, end quote, actually means. The Epstein files moved to inside pages. Bondi impeachment, not trending anymore. The 77% poll buried under Venezuela hot takes. Survivor testimony crowded out by foreign policy experts. And here's the really elegant part. Bondi's role transformed overnight. On Thursday, she was the attorney general who violated a statute and might face impeachment. On Friday, she was the attorney general prosecuting a narco-terrorist dictator. Her office announced that Maduro would be arraigned Monday morning in Manhattan. So Monday's news coverage wasn't going to be about Bondi defying Congress. It was going to be about Bondi in court presenting the case against a captured foreign leader. This is not mysterious. This is how attention economics works. Think about what makes foreign military action so commanding of media attention. You've got visual drama, explosions, military hardware, maps with arrows, leaders being perp-walked off planes. You've got the national security framing, which immediately elevates the president's role as commander-in-chief. You've got the breaking news aesthetic, where every hour brings updates. Maduro's plane landed. Here's the first photo. Here's what the UN is saying. Here's what China just announced. It's inherently televisual in a way that a statutory deadline violation is not. Compare that to the Epstein files story. How do you visualize a missed deadline? You can show a calendar. You can show redacted pages with black bars. You can show survivors at a press conference or senators reading statements. None of that has the immediate visual impact of military footage or a captured leader in handcuffs. Foreign crises also create what political scientists call the opposition dilemma. If you criticize the operation, you risk appearing to undermine the troops or aid America's enemies. If you don't criticize it, you abandon your principles on issues like War Powers Act compliance. This trap is especially effective because it shifts the terrain. Domestic accountability is Congress's strength. They have subpoena power. They control oversight. They can hold hearings. But foreign policy is the executive branch's traditional domain. The president is commander-in-chief. Even when military action is legally questionable, criticizing it during the operation itself carries political risk. So Democrats were divided. Some immediately condemned the operation as an illegal war. Others were more cautious, not wanting to appear weak on dictators or unsupportive of deployed personnel. That division means the opposition's voice is fragmented, which means the story becomes about democratic disagreement rather than about executive overreach. The news cycle is finite. There are only 24 hours in a day. Cable news can only focus on so many stories. Front pages have limited space. Congressional hearings can't all happen simultaneously. And research consistently shows that the public can only track about 2 or 3 major stories at once before everything else becomes background noise. Venezuela consumed all of that available oxygen. Every cable news hour, every front page, every trending topic, every congressional statement. The attention that had been building around Bondi's impeachment didn't just decrease, it effectively disappeared. Now, some of you might be thinking, this is just coincidence. Things happen. Maduro had been under indictment since 2020. Maybe the opportunity just arose. Maybe operational considerations determined the timing. Let me show you why that explanation is insufficient. Bill Clinton, December 1998. The House of Representatives is 3 days away from voting to impeach him over the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Pressure is mounting daily. On December 16th, Clinton orders Operation Desert Fox. 4 days of sustained bombing against Iraq, targeting Saddam Hussein's alleged weapons of mass destruction sites. The impeachment vote is scheduled for December 19th. The bombing starts 3 days before. The media pivots. Cable news covers the strikes around the clock. Some Republicans urge delaying the impeachment vote during military action. Clinton's approval ratings increased during the bombing campaign. Critics call it wag the dog, after the movie that had just come out about a president fabricating a war to distract from a sex scandal. The impeachment proceeds, but the media oxygen is split between 2 massive stories instead of focused on one. Richard Nixon, 1970. Watergate is beginning to heat up. Domestic pressure over Vietnam is mounting. On April 30th, Nixon announces the invasion of Cambodia, expanding the war into a neutral country. The national security crisis dominates coverage for weeks. When domestic scandals resurface later, each new Watergate revelation coincides with escalations in Cambodia or Laos. Sustained foreign crisis equals sustained distraction from domestic crimes. Donald Trump, January 2020. The House has just impeached him over Ukraine in December 2019. The Senate trial is scheduled for mid-January. Questions are swirling about whether John Bolton will testify. On January 3, 2020, exactly 16 days after the House impeachment vote, Trump orders a drone strike that kills Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. The justification is imminent threat to Americans. The result is near war with Iran and a global crisis. The media pivots again. The Senate trial proceeds, but coverage is split between impeachment and potential war with Iran. Some Democrats urge pausing criticism during the crisis. Trump is acquitted on February 5th. The foreign crisis narrative of President defending America competes with the domestic narrative of President abusing power. Do you see the pattern? It's not partisan. Both parties have done this. It's not limited to one type of crisis. It's Iraq, Cambodia, Iran, Venezuela. And it's not limited to one kind of domestic pressure. It's sex scandals, Watergate, Ukraine impeachment, and now Epstein files. The common elements are consistent. Foreign military action when domestic political pressure peaks, major operations that justify wall-to-wall coverage, unprecedented framing that makes everything newsworthy, unilateral executive action that reinforces presidential authority, immediate media pivot from domestic scandal to foreign crisis, and opposition forced to choose between accountability and being seen as undermining troops. This is not conspiracy. This is pattern recognition. And the pattern reveals a structural incentive. Here's what I mean by incentive structure. If you are an administration facing domestic accountability pressure, foreign military action offers several things simultaneously. It resets the media ecosystem within hours. Every outlet pivots to the crisis, and previous stories lose oxygen. It transforms roles. The official under scrutiny becomes the official managing a national security response. It divides the opposition. Critics must choose between their principles on war powers and the political risk of appearing to undermine military operations. It shifts the terrain from domestic accountability, where Congress is strong, to foreign policy, where executive power is traditionally dominant. And it creates what researchers call the rally around the flag effect. Presidential approval typically increases 5 to 10 points during international crises as the public defaults to supporting the commander-in-chief. None of this requires a meeting where someone explicitly says, "Let's invade another country to distract from our scandals." The incentives are structural. When you're politically vulnerable domestically and you have the option to take dramatic foreign action, that option becomes attractive for reasons that have nothing to do with foreign policy itself. And this is where attention economics becomes crucial. News coverage is genuinely finite. There are only so many hours in a broadcast day, only so many reporters to assign to stories, only so much space on front pages, only so much bandwidth in the public's attention span. Research in cognitive science shows that people can track maybe 2 or 3 major issues at a time before everything else becomes background static. Agenda-setting theory demonstrates that media coverage determines what the public thinks about, not necessarily what to think, but which issues even register as important. And studies on presidential approval show that foreign crises reliably produce rally effects that last 3 to 6 months on average. So when Venezuela explodes into the news cycle, it's not just competing with the Epstein file story. It's consuming the entire attention ecosystem. Reporters get reassigned from domestic accountability to foreign crisis. Editorial meetings prioritize the breaking international story over the slower domestic scandal. Congressional hearing schedules get upended because members have to respond to the Venezuela situation immediately. The effect is the same, whether it was meticulously planned or opportunistically seized. Bondi was facing impeachment. Venezuela happened. Bondi is no longer facing immediate impeachment pressure. The media moved on. The congressional agenda changed. The survivors lost their platform, at least temporarily. Let me address the defenses you're going to hear, because they're predictable and they're insufficient. First, this is about Maduro, not domestic politics. He was indicted in 2020. There's a $50 million bounty on him. He runs a narco-trafficking operation. True, all of that is true. The question is not whether Maduro deserves prosecution. The question is, why now? He's been under indictment for almost 5 years. Why this specific weekend, 4 days before Congress returns? 48 hours after a bipartisan impeachment effort gained momentum. You can believe Maduro deserves to be in custody and still notice that the timing is remarkably convenient. Second, you're politicizing national security. No, we're asking questions about legal authority and timing. The War Powers Act exists because Congress is supposed to authorize military action. Multiple senators and representatives, including Republicans like Thomas Massie, have said this operation appears to violate the War Powers Act. Asking whether the executive branch followed the law is not politicizing anything. It's basic constitutional oversight, and questioning timing is not undermining troops. The troops didn't choose when to execute this operation. They followed orders. The orders came from political leadership, and political leadership is subject to scrutiny. Third, this is conspiracy theory thinking. Except it's not. We're not claiming secret meetings or fabricated intelligence. We're observing a documented pattern across multiple administrations and explaining the incentive structures that make this pattern repeat. Political science has studied this for decades. It's called diversionary war theory. Leaders use foreign conflict to distract from domestic problems. The evidence is empirical, not speculative. Leaders facing domestic political trouble are statistically more likely to initiate military force. The rally effect is measurable. The media attention shift is observable. This is not conspiracy. It's political science. Fourth, Clinton did this. Why are you only mad when it's Trump? Actually, critics did call out Clinton in 1998. The wag the dog comparisons were everywhere. The difference is that this pattern has now repeated so many times that we should recognize it as systemic rather than exceptional. Both parties do this. That doesn't make it acceptable. Two wrongs don't make a right. The fact that this is bipartisan should make us more concerned, not less, because it means the incentive structure transcends individual administrations. Fifth, this makes America safer by removing a drug kingpin. Does it? Representative Jake Auchincloss said explicitly that this is blood for oil and has nothing to do with narco-trafficking. The administration's own statements emphasized seizing oil reserves. Venezuela has the world's largest proven oil reserves. Meanwhile, the drug actually killing Americans is fentanyl, which comes primarily from China and Mexico, not Venezuela. If this were genuinely about the drug crisis, why aren't we invading the countries that are the actual source? The narco-trafficking justification doesn't survive scrutiny. So, what should you be watching for? In the short term, does Congress maintain focus on the Epstein files, or does that accountability process get delayed indefinitely? Will the contempt vote against Bondi happen when Congress returns, or will members decide it looks tone-deaf during a foreign policy crisis? Do the survivors get their platform to testify, or does Venezuela consume all available hearing time? And does Bondi's role as the prosecutor in the Maduro case insulate her from impeachment pressure? In the medium term, how long does the U.S. presence in Venezuela last? Do troops deploy? And if so, how many? Does an insurgency develop as Maduro loyalists resist? Do U.S. oil companies enter Venezuela? And which ones benefit? Does this become another Iraq-style quagmire? Or does the administration somehow manage a clean exit? And politically, does this help or hurt Republicans in the 2026 midterms? In the long term, the next time domestic pressure builds on this administration or any future administration, watch what happens with foreign policy. If the pattern repeats, if another crisis erupts at another politically convenient moment, then we're not talking about isolated incidents. We're talking about a structural feature of how executive power operates when under pressure. Also watch the accountability outcomes. Does the Inspector General audit of the Epstein files happen quietly or get buried? Do the million more documents ever actually appear, or was that Christmas Eve announcement just a stalling tactic? Do future prosecutors use the evidence being gathered now to bring charges after this administration leaves office? Certain statutes of limitations are running, but those clocks don't run forever. Here's what this comes down to. Attention is finite. News coverage is finite. Congressional hearing time is finite. Public focus is finite. When you control the timing of dramatic foreign action, you control what the entire political ecosystem talks about. On January 2nd, the conversation was about Pam Bondi violating a statute, facing bipartisan impeachment, with 77% of poll respondents supporting accountability. Survivors were organizing. Congress was returning. The machinery of oversight was turning. On January 3rd, all of that disappeared from the front page. You don't need to prove intent to observe effect. You don't need a smoking gun memo to recognize a pattern. And you don't need to be a conspiracy theorist to understand incentive structures. What you need to do is notice what disappeared. Notice who benefits when the media ecosystem resets. Notice when domestic accountability pressure gets interrupted by foreign crises. And notice when it keeps happening, administration after administration, in remarkably similar ways. Because this is how agenda flooding works at the nation-state level. Whether the Venezuela operation was planned months ago or executed opportunistically this weekend, the effect is the same. Domestic pressure is relieved. Media attention is redirected. Opposition is divided. And accountability is interrupted. This is not about vilifying anyone's motives. This is about understanding how power operates. This is about recognizing that when you're facing impeachment, a foreign crisis is remarkably useful. Not because it makes the underlying problem go away, but because it changes what everyone is paying attention to. And in politics, as in life, what people pay attention to determines what actually matters. The Epstein files deadline was missed. That's a fact. A bipartisan impeachment effort was building momentum. That's a fact. Venezuela happened, and all of that disappeared from the front page. That's a fact. The pattern has repeated for decades. That's a fact. The incentive structure makes foreign crises attractive when domestic pressure peaks. That's a fact. Everything else is just whether you're willing to notice.
Thanks for spending a few minutes digging into this with me. If you want more grounded, progressive commentary without the outrage bait, subscribe and stick around. Every time you watch, share, and engage, it helps build a community that believes democracy is worth understanding and defending. I'll see you in the next video.